For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kate O'Grady and I work in the Public Library Services team at the State Library. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting. I work and live on Gadigal land and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are with us today. Today, I'm very excited to introduce Helen Caple and Ping Tian. Helen is an Associate Professor in Communications and Journalism at the University of New South Wales, and Ping is an Honorary Associate in the Department of Linguistics at the University of Sydney. Helen and Ping have partnered with us on the Diverse Picture Books project, and I have thoroughly enjoyed working on this project, and I'd like to thank all of you who have suggested books to include in the list. We literally couldn't have done it without you. I'm really pleased that Helen and Ping can share their experience of the project with you today, and they would also like to hear from you at the end of the session. So please keep your microphone muted throughout the presentation, and at the end you'll have the opportunity to ask questions and discuss. If you have any issues with anything to do with the technology, just pop that into chat and Ellen and I will attempt to sort that out for you. And we are recording now, and that's for the presentation, which we will share later to anyone who is interested. We'll stop recording at the end of the presentation and we'll start recording again for the discussion, but that's just for our own information so we can follow up on anything that's discussed. So we won't be sharing that after the session more broadly. But that's it from me, and I'd just like to hand over to Helen.
Many thanks, Kate. I too would like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and also to the Dharawal Nation, which is where Ping is coming to us from. So today I'm going to be speaking on behalf of both myself and Ping, and we will both be answering questions at the end of the talk, but just for the sake of simplicity, I will present to you first up. And thank you all for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time to spend the afternoon with us, having a look at the representation of diversity in early childhood picture books. So I'm going to start at the beginning of what was the inspiration for this project. And this was a tweet that came into my Twitter feed back in November 2019. And it was a question from Anita Heiss about diversity in children's books in Australia that I felt compelled to try and find an answer to. At the time, I was working with the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Division at UNSW, working in their LGBTIQA+ division. And I was examining the use of gendered language in UNSW policy. So I had an interest at the time in diversity issues, and I was already starting to think about this kind of space. Ping, as a mother of a young child, not yet 2, was struggling to find representations of herself in the literature that they were reading together. And Ping was struck at one point by the fact that her daughter reacted very strongly to the shared reading of this book here. And in fact, her daughter, on seeing this book, shouted out, "Look, mummy, mummy, there's you." And her daughter was not even 2 years old yet, and was able to recognize that the literature that they were reading didn't actually look much like either of them. So both Ping and I have the same background in our research and theoretical underpinnings of the work that we do. We both come from a linguistics and social semiotics background. And this means that we examine meaning making at the intersection of words and images in their social context. Now for Ping, her work has largely been in researching children's literature. However, my research has focused more on photojournalism and news discourse. However, when this question came up, I reached out to Ping and I said, let's have a go at this question. Let's see what answers we can find. Now, what Anita Heiss is referring to in this tweet here is a study that was published in the US that looked at over 3,000 books published in 2018. Now, this is an excellent visualization in one respect, in that it is a lovely homage to Rudine Sims Bishop and her oft-cited metaphor of mirrors and windows. And the idea behind this is that we see our world reflected back to us, but also sometimes we can be allowed to look through onto the worlds of others and their experiences. However, at the same time, as you can already see, this is actually quite a stark and quite depressing reminder that that world that we look at is still largely male and white. And as you can see, this young man is firmly in the center of this particular universe, and the minority groups are exactly that, still very much on the periphery of the storytelling that was happening in this particular instance. So we started to look around at what work has been done. And we found a very similar survey in the UK on children's books published in 2017. And again, the results are very similar. And research in Australia hadn't looked at a particular year, but we did find the work of Helen Adam and her colleagues in Western Australia. They had examined book collections in early childhood settings or early education settings. And again, they found very similar results. And so what we can find here is that the dominant culture viewpoints and ideologies prevail in children's book publishing. And where the books do include representations of minority groups, these are usually largely stereotypical or somewhat tokenistic. Now, with Helen Adams' research, they looked at any and all books that were circulated in these early education settings. So that didn't necessarily mean that the books that they were looking at were only Australian. So for us, we wanted to look at Australian picture books. And so our focus was very much on Australian picture book publishing and Australian authors and illustrators. And our approach to diversity is one that focuses on the lived experiences of marginalised groups in Australia. So those that have traditionally been excluded from positions of power. So this means looking at non-dominant cultural groups and their languages, people living with disabilities, gender diverse people, and also at the representation of girls and women. Now, the first question we had to ask ourselves when we started to conceptualize this project was to just say, well, what data are we going to look at and how are we going to get hold of it? Would it be feasible to look at all picture books published in any given year, and why only look at 1 year? So we started to do some background reading, and we established early on that book awards, especially the CBCA, seems to be very important in the Australian context. And early childhood seems to be where a lot of research has been focused. And there's good reasons for this that we will come to in a moment. So we had a look at the CBCA and we saw that they had this early childhood category, and that this category of award has only been in place for the last 20 years, since 2001. So this is a very neat, very small data set that we could start to have a look at. So we set out with this analysis just by looking at these 118 shortlisted books, picture books in the CBCA Book of the Year Early Childhood category. So just to clarify then, we are not looking at 1 year, nor could we answer the entire question posed by Anita Heiss, but we would say that there are 2 pretty good reasons for starting with both early childhood and with award lists. So early childhood literature, the research on early childhood picture books tells us that these are significant cultural artifacts, that they help children to learn about their world. But most importantly here is that picture books may indeed help to temper biases that begin from a very early age. The second motivation for this work was to focus on prize winners. And this was because of the massive influence that the CBCA has on what our very young are exposed to. And they are widely distributed and they are incorporated into education curriculum. You yourselves will be using them all the time in your libraries. And this means that these books are likely to be the basis of the creation of the canon of messages that are the most widely consumed in Australian society. There was also another reason for choosing prize winners, and that was a very pragmatic decision, simply because it gave us an externally validated category for book selection. And so our data ended up being these 118 shortlisted books in the category early childhood. So the next step for us was to determine our diversity categories. So what were we going to investigate and how would we code our data? So again, starting from the literature that we were engaging with at the time. So these are the kinds of diversity categories that we found in the literature. So looking at things like race and ethnicity, gender, sexuality, disability, multilingualism. And the kinds of coding that other researchers were doing were by looking at things like physical representation, looking at cultural beliefs or how people dressed, or the characters in the books dressed. So physical settings and the context in which the story is taking place, and the presence of cultural objects or cultural symbols to signify a particular cultural or ethnic group. So we use this analysis to help us to, or this background reading to help us to set up our own analytical categories. And so these are the categories that we use to examine the CBCA dataset that we collected. So we looked at gender, ethnicity, disability, sexuality, and linguistic variation. And of course, we acknowledge that there are many other diversity categories that we could have taken up in this analysis, but we didn't take these up here because the ones that we list are the most frequently used, and we wanted our research to be to some extent comparable with what has gone before. Now, in coding our data, we looked at both the visual representation and the verbal constructions within the picture books. And this is an example here from our coding book, our coding manual of how we analysed for gender. Now, our coding manual is available on the Open Science Framework, and this is a website and it's all open access. And so if you'd like more details on the full coding manual, you can go and have a look there and access our data, our coding manuals there. But I'm not going to go into the actual analysis that we did on the books today, but rather I'm going to skip that section and go straight into what we found in our analysis. So these are our findings of our analysis of the picture books. Now, obviously, there were some picture books that involved animal characters and some that involved human characters. So the analysis that we are sharing with you here is only about the human characters in the books. And these are our results for all human characters, no matter what their role is in the story. So we looked at both the main characters and we looked at the wider story world in which the main characters operated in the books. So we get some good results in terms of gender equity. So we have an even split in terms of representation of both those conforming to male and female characters. And this is across not just the main characters, but across all of the characters that we found in the books. In terms of ethnicity, we found that the book collection is overwhelmingly white. And just to show you a little bit of a deeper engagement with those results, just so that you can see where those non-white characters appear. So if we look at the top graph here, these are just the main characters. So you can see that across the 20 years, only 3 books have had non-white characters in the main character role. And the lower chart shows us the wider story world in which the main characters operate. And if we want to take a positive out of this, I guess we could look at the last 5 years and think that the story world is actually starting to develop some diversity in it, if we are trying to find some positives in these results. So we only had 1 human main character who was living with a disability. There was no representation of gender, sex, or sexually diverse characters. And there were only 4 instances of any kind of other language or dialect. And one of these was even an invented language. So just to sum up our findings, and just to be clear as well that the books that make the CBCA shortlist do so on the basis of their literary merit. So diversity isn't a category for book selection in the shortlist. So unfortunately, the early childhood shortlist does not reflect the varieties of disability, sexual identity, ethnic backgrounds, and language groups that have constituted Australian society over the last 20 years. There are only 2 main characters living with a disability. One is an animal, one is a human, and there are no characters who are sexually and or gender diverse. And of course, the main characters are still overwhelmingly white. And so again, if we try to focus on the positives from this analysis, we can see some ethnic diversity coming into the story world in the last few years, and there is a balance in the binarized male-female gender representations in these books. So, while we understand the importance and the dominance of the CBCA shortlist in creating this canon of stories that are shared, we also believe that there is a world beyond the CBCA shortlist. And so we turn to public libraries to help us to source diverse literature that we know that is out there. That we know that there are books, for example, like this one, that are there circulating that don't necessarily make these awards. And so what happened next after we'd done this piece of analysis was a process of connecting with the State Library of New South Wales. And that started first with a member of library staff from a New South Wales library got in touch with us and wanted to know more about accessing diverse literature. And so we exchanged a few emails, and that led to an introduction to Kate O'Grady at the State Library. And likewise, Kate, it's been amazing to work with you at the State Library, and I've really appreciated the efficiency with which you have conducted this little aspect, this part of our research together. So we met with the State Library, and of course we agreed to work together. And so we discussed what the State Library wanted out of this project, and we also discussed what we wanted out of this project. And so for us, we wanted to tap into the lived expertise of the library staff, who have a wealth of knowledge about children's literature and have options for reading materials that genuinely engage with diversity. And so we, Ping and I, wanted to harness that knowledge in gathering those suggestions and to create more diverse reading options that we could then share widely. For the State Library wanted a resource that not only shared these diverse reading lists with library staff across the state, but that also aimed to give staff critical literacy tools to be able to assess the books for their diversity themselves. And so after connecting with the State Library, we then developed a survey together. And that was sent out to all of you in the New South Wales library universe. And importantly, for us as researchers, when we surveyed the library staff, we asked that you also provide a short text that told us why you were suggesting this book. And I will explain why that was important to us in just a moment. So once we'd done the survey, we went through a process of examining those survey results and then went on to develop our diversity resources. So I'll just take you through that process of what we did with your survey data. So we received 121 different book suggestions, and so far we have received and analysed 67 of those books. So this means that the work is not yet finished. There will be more to come. And when we got these books, we went through a process of starting by reading those books for ourselves before we engaged with the survey results. And so it started off with Ping evaluating whether or not she would have included the books in our diverse reads list. And she was drawing on her professional expertise. And we also started to make notes on what things we were looking for, what were the qualities of the story that we wanted to look for that told us that these were adequate books for us. And then we did some cleaning up of the data, and so we made sure that they were accurate, and we looked at the comments that came in from library staff. And we started to look more closely at what library staff had actually written themselves, their personal comments. And we took keywords out of these comments and tried to examine what the qualities of the picture books were that library staff were picking up on. So, for example, the quality of the visuals, their role in the story telling, whether or not issues were normalized, whether or not topics were dealt with sensitively, and that these kinds of language was being used by the library staff. And so then, by using that language used by the library staff, we then started to formulate together a set of assessment criteria out of these personal comments. And then we drew on Ping's analysis of the picture books and brought together a draft of our assessment criteria. And then I went back to the books and I reanalyzed those books using the draft criteria to see whether or not I could actually use them. And then finally, we sent a version out to the State Library, and with a little bit more tweaking, we settled on this final version of the criteria that we will show you in just a moment. But first, I just want to talk you through some of the differences that we found in what Ping and I were noticing in the data and what library staff were noticing in the data. And so some of the works we found overly moralistic or didactic words, and that we would have been less likely to have included such works in our reading list, because they tend to deal in stereotypes, and there's not a lot of nuance or engagement with diversity. Some books were recommended that are fantastic literary works, but they're not about diversity. So we actually did eliminate those books. We had works recommended by diverse authors, but they were telling mainstream stories, so actually not addressing diversity in the storytelling. But this is an aspect of diversity that we will come back to in a moment. And some works were international works, and we excluded these simply because we wanted to focus on diversity issues in the Australian context. So this is the criteria that we ended up with. And remember, this is about the diversity that is represented in the storytelling and in the characters, not among the producers of texts. So it is also limited to representations of the mostly disempowered in society who struggle to have their voices heard. And so in addition to the categories that we introduced earlier, we also included rural and regional experiences in this. Now, in terms of characterization, this concerns the realistic depiction of people, so not stereotypes or special cases. So we're talking here about the largely normalized retellings of the life experiences of these particular groups, these diverse groups. And then that these stories are thematized, so central to the story, and not just special mentions or not just tokenistic gestures towards a group. And then that this storytelling is developed in both words and illustrations, looking towards creating a complex world for that group or that person that encourages deep engagement with the characters. And we also found that teachable moments was an important aspect of our criteria. So opportunities to take the discussion further, maybe into real world experiences of the reader. And so it's important to acknowledge here that we cannot cover the entire experiences of a marginalized group in one book. We don't ever expect to. And so this is where our criteria can be viewed as quite specific in their focus. And so our criteria are focused on the individual book doing a good job of representing a person in a realistic, complex and meaningful way. And so we would encourage you to furnish your collection with multiple books dealing with the multiple diversities within a particular group. And that, sort of acknowledge that while a book may individually dive into one aspect of that group, the collection as a whole might come to represent more fully the complexities of diversities within a group as well. So I just want to give you some examples from the survey and show you how and why we chose these books. So the first one is Mrs. White and the Red Desert. This book engages with the daily lived experiences of a remote Indigenous community. And in line with our criteria, this does not represent the experiences of all Indigenous communities, and instead it should be seen as one amongst a collection of stories. So while it's based on the recollection of an older person recounting their time, the time that their teacher came to tea during a sandstorm, the child's perspective remains at the center of the storytelling, and it is a realistic character identity that is developed throughout the story. In terms of theme, the story world centers on the close association with the environment and how this influences the imagination of the children. And this is co-constructed multimodally in the interplay between words and illustrations, as you can see in this visual here on the right, where the wind is racing around the house. So ultimately, Mrs. White gets to experience the world from the child's perspective and develops a deeper understanding of the way things simply are for this community. And so this book also has rich multimodal storytelling. So there are ample teachable moments in looking at how both the verbal and visual resources co-contribute to this storytelling. So the book Some Girls was a book that we debated, and I would say that it sits somewhat at the opposite end of the scale to Mrs. White and the Red Desert, because rather than telling a story about a particular child's experiences, the book lists all possible permutations of what a girl can be. So this book is essentially a taxonomy. It just lists all the possible types of girlhood. However, in doing so, it falls into the trap of essentializing girlhood. And of course, it necessarily has to eliminate anyone who doesn't conform to the gender binary. And so it can't really avoid alienating those who do not experience the world as either a boy or a girl. But it does obviously then, of course, give us tremendous opportunities for education engagement. Now, the next book, On the River, is a book that we rejected. The first reason for this is because the perspective through which the story is told is that of a white male as he travels along the Murray River, and all of the happenings are filtered through the white settler colonial perspective. There's only one sentence in the entire book that speaks to the Indigenous connections to the waterways, and this is only to pre-colonial times. So the male gaze is also evident in the illustrations, with women mostly being depicted as large-breasted, dressed in bikinis or scantily clad. And the focus of the book remains on visitors to the river. So it's more like a travel guide as it goes through following the river from its source to the ocean. And the focus remains on those who visit the river for its recreational value rather than engaging with the lived experiences of those who have a long-term relationship with the river. Now, the book clearly does also have a political undertone, but again, these come from the dominant cultural perspective. And the book has literary merits for other reasons, in that it deals with the diversity of the river itself. And it has good intentions in terms of protecting and caring for our waterways, but it doesn't focus on the diversities that we were looking at through our criteria. And just one last example to give you is, this is a book by Amberlynn Quaimulina, and it's a great book by a diverse author, but it doesn't address diversity in the storytelling. So again, this is not included in our book list. Rather, this speaks to another very important aspect of diversity, another type of diversity, and that is that we should build book collections to be inclusive of diverse authors and illustrators. And we should also remember that an author who happens to be from, say, for example, one of our diverse categories may not automatically want to write about that particular group's experiences. Now, as you will no doubt know, the resource is here at the library, and you can download the picture book list as it stands at the moment, and remember that this is incomplete and it will be updated. And we have a few suggestions on the website here of books and the diversity categories that they respond to. And you can also download the diversity criteria and start assessing your own book collections for yourselves using that assessment criteria in a spreadsheet if you wish to use it. Now, just to conclude the talk, I just want to go back to the CBCA and just note that there are some encouraging signs at the CBCA. So this year's Early Childhood Award shortlisted a gay book, the first time it has done so. We are also immensely grateful for the opportunity to connect with you and to encourage you to look beyond the CBCA. And we hope that the assessment criteria will give you a way into assessing your books and your book collections for yourselves. And just one final word, just to go back to the very beginning, is to remember that this is a social justice issue. Children's picture books do offer us this view, this way into the ideologies and values and beliefs of the dominant culture. And this has a significant impact on a child's understanding of themselves and their role and their position in the world. What we need to do is to challenge that dominant worldview, and we can do this by opening up that world to include stories told from the perspective of non-dominant cultural groups. And that's what we are hoping that the diverse reads list will actually do, and give you those choices. We also need to draw on the power of picture books to act as a genuine vehicle for creating a more empathetic society, and use that power to temper the biases that begin in early childhood and extend their knowledge and understanding of those who look and sound different to themselves. And to go back to Rudine Sims Bishop, remember, we simply, we cannot be what we cannot see. So I will leave it there. And if you would like to connect with us or to access any of our publications, these are our respective email addresses. We have a couple of publications out on this now, so we'd be very happy to share those with you. And if any of you would like to pick up any references from today, what I've talked about in this talk, then here's a list of references if you would like to have a look at that. Okay, so I will leave it there and hand back over to Kate to lead us into discussion.
Thanks, Helen.